So let's go to KB. KB is from TISS, most of you probably know them. They are also part of Hasrat-e-Zindagi Mamuli and they teach at TISS.
Okay, thank you. My job is in the next 15 minutes to try and summarize this report, which Anika says between 1st April to 17th April, 228 pages were written. I was part of the Jansunvai but not part of the writing, which is why now I have the job of summarizing in 15 minutes. So bear with me just to give you a sense of the report. Like I said, it's a 228 page PDF document. It's available on the PUCL website to download. If any of you need copies because somehow there is an issue with downloading, just let us know, give your email ID, we'll send the copy. Currently the report is in English but it's being translated into multiple languages and we are hoping that will be out soon. The report I think can be broadly divided into 3 parts. First is the section where the organizers of the Jansunvai tell us about who we are, a little bit about the testifiers, their background, the panel members, and also the process of the Jansunvai. I mean that it's a it's a public hearing, but it's a closed door public hearing. What went into thinking about this, and actually a lot of care went into planning it. So some of that is the first section. The second section, which probably is the longest, over 100 pages or so, it's divided into about 4 or 5 parts, which basically go into nature of violence, types of violence, sites of violence that people have talked about. Looking at the collusion of family as institution with other institutions like the police, like care establishments, rehabilitation homes, mental health care treatment centers, and also to some extent courts. So it sort of goes into the collusion of these. It also, a part of this second bit, apart from narratives about the experiences that people spoke about, also goes into sort of locating natal family violence against queer and trans people within a larger context of movements that have been active in the country, trying to place the question of violence both in domestic and public spheres. So basically movements that have fought for violence against women, violence against couples in intercaste, interreligious marriages. So the report sort of does a very, very, I think, succinct job of trying to place the stories of violence against queer and trans people that we heard about in the context of all of this work that's been happening around sort of addressing issues of violence. In some ways it also, like Chanika said, sort of pushes us to look at why is it that we have not been talking as much about natal family violence or families that have been assigned to us at birth, while we've been talking quite a lot about marital violence or violence in marital homes, which means we've been talking about cisgender heterosexual married women very often. So it sort of gets us to think about some of these issues. The final section, which I'm not going to be talking about much, Veena is going to be talking about it, which is focusing on recommendations in law and policy, basically to provide redressal for violence, also looking at protection against violence, particularly in natal families for queer and trans folks, and generally what are the things that need to be done in order to make it possible for queer and trans folks to live, survive, but also possibly thrive. Yeah? So that's broadly what the report does. Just to give you a sense of who are the people who spoke to the panel. Chanika has already introduced who the panelists were, so I'm just going to tell you who the testifiers were. We had 31 people speaking on the 1st of April to the panel of 8 people. So these 31 people were basically people from different parts of the country. There were 6 couples, there were 16 people who spoke as individuals, and there were 3 people who spoke through organizations about the work that they do in the context of violence and crisis. There were 16 trans men, 10 cis women who were queer, 3 non-binary, 1 gender fluid person, 1 trans woman. The participants spoke in 6 languages: Bangla, Kannada, Telugu, Malayalam, Hindi and English. They were from different states: Rajasthan, Haryana, Delhi, Uttar Pradesh from the north, West Bengal, Odisha, Assam, Manipur from east and northeast, Maharashtra in the west, Andhra Pradesh, Kerala, Karnataka, Telangana in the south. Right? Out of the 31 people who spoke, 23 were from Hindu families, 5 Muslims, 1 Jain, 1 Christian, 9 were from scheduled caste backgrounds, 4 from OBC castes, 7 from dominant castes, and 11 castes that we don't know. So this is broadly the background of the panelists. Now, like I said, the main part of the report is actually looking at the different types or forms of violence and perpetrators and sites of violence. So I'm just going to start with one of the commonest themes that we heard about was even before sexuality is known, gender is out there. So much before the person has expressed or even probably experienced and has the words to talk about their sexual difference, their gender difference is something that is visible to everyone, which means it gets policed and it gets surveilled upon, and the attempts to correct gender expression violently begin much sooner. So we in fact had one person who said that somebody came and told my father that your daughter, quote unquote daughter, hangs out, she's with, seen with too many men. And so this person is thinking about it and saying that, I just didn't realize that this was a problem. I never saw myself as a girl. Obviously, I was hanging out with so many boys and that was a problem, and this led to this particular respondent being taken out from school because they were just with so many men, and they themselves had never read themselves as woman or as girl, and it's as inappropriate. So that's where we heard quite a lot of policing around gender expression. We heard about forms of violence, like of course physical violence, a lot of beating up. I think Mihir talked about some extreme forms of violence. We also heard about people being drugged, being taken to another state. There was a lesbian woman in her 40s who was married for a very long period of time, being drugged, taken out of where she was living and taken to another state, which also means that there is no support. So her partner was in this place, so she's taken to the other place. Where the partner, the organization that's supporting her, there's nobody there. One other sort of, in the context of violence that's been reflected in the report is this idea of enforced migration. That people having to run away from family, which means run away from everything that's known to you and having to somehow, just for survival. I really like this phrase that's been used called displaced adulting for survival. That it's part of growing up, that if you want to survive and you want to not be pushed into gender and sexuality that is not yours, the only way is actually to run away. So we heard about stories of enforced migration. We heard about house arrest, taking away phone, cutting off people from anybody who could be possibly supported. Threats of sexual assault, corrective rape, the idea that being with a real man would cure the person of their gender sexuality. Curiosity, checking of genitals about what is your reality. The reality of your gender purportedly in the body. So these were some of the forms of violence that we heard about. I'm just going to read out one quote to you. The report says that families retaliate with sexually abusive behavior when they find it difficult to accept sexual choices of their wards. This could range from invalidating of desire through attributions of sinfulness or sickness associated with their desire and sexuality, to threats of corrective rape, to actual molestation, from a sickening curiosity about genitals of young trans persons to actual cases of stripping, to know the sex, the reality of sex and gender in the body or place there. We also heard some very, very disturbing stories of children, so young people as young as 14. And this happened, these were stories from West Bengal, from Andhra Pradesh, from Kerala, of young people being forced into marriages at the age of 14, which meant, of course, marital rape. Starvation in marital homes as a way to correct this person, where they will come out and say that I am a man, I am a trans man, I can't be with another man. Being forced into basic forced pregnancy and childbirth. So these were some people who spoke about being pushed into not just marriages but also having children as a sort of initiation into a cishet way of living. Another example really, this whole forced marriage business as a way to fix this uncontrollable deviant child and pass on the responsibility somehow to someone else, which is something that families or natal families seem to be doing. We heard one story actually of a trans man who speaks about having finally got out of his marital home, who now is no longer allowed to meet his child, and the child has been turned against this trans man. And where the trans guy is always asked that what kind of a mother are you wear a shirt pant and you have short hair. So it's to choose between being a parent and being your real gender that you are. The other sort of normativizing corrective institution that we heard about repeatedly was that of mental hospitals and institutions, where people were, so we heard of a trans man who beat up his husband on the first night when there was forcible sort of sexual advances. And for this person was put into a mental hospital and was given a series of ECTs as a way to cure this person. So this trans man said that what they saw was a Muslim woman who was just refusing to follow every form of norm, and that is how they were being treated in this mental hospital. We heard of a cis woman who was put into a rehab home because she was in love with a trans man. There were of course the temples and the tantrics who were providing all kinds of dawas. There was also a dargah which was providing sort of stuff to drug and basically sedate the woman and sort of as a way to fix the problem. So we basically heard, when we talk about violence, we heard both about violence as a corrective measure, as a way to correct the deviant, wayward gender sexuality. We also heard, of course, of violence as punishment, which was sold to the world as a rescue. So you're rescuing your daughter from this trans man, right? You're basically giving her a chance at life. And so that's the sort of moral correctness or moral platitude from where the families would seek help from police, would seek help from doctors, that after all what you're doing is you're just giving her a chance at a normal life. So what you're doing as punishment is seen by the world as somehow the family is rightfully trying to save their child. So those are the kinds of things that we heard about. There was also violence directed at mothers for poor parenting of their trans and queer kids. We had heard about one person saying that my father sent the mother and the trans man as a child were sent away to the mother's home, saying that don't come back till she learns to behave like a girl. So till you, till then, don't come back. So, so in that sense, we also heard about mothers participating in violence against their children and sort of playing their part in the patriarchal family. We heard about violence against partners, particularly those partners who were seen as men, so trans men, those who were Muslim, those who were seen as being from lower castes. So there were a lot of stories of somebody who's from a dominant caste, also like an intercaste relationship, and apart from the queer transness to it, there is also the angle of purity, pollution, caste, all of those things that we heard about. Violence during lockdown was another set of things. We heard of actually a trans man and his partner, police intervention, where basically the families with the help of police separated the two, and this trans man, in order to be able to access, be able to go visit her, he had to actually on foot go from where he was to the city, to the commissioner office to get a pass in order to be able to reach her. And this was of course the case of habeas corpus because nobody knew where this woman was. And so you had to go to court saying that she has been sort of abducted. So many of these kinds of, another trans man living on platform for about 19 days after a bout of violence at home. So these were some examples of kinds of violence. Police acting hand in glove with families was again a very common thing that we heard about. Police taking on the role of counselor. Police saying that I will make her alright, asking questions like what is there between your legs, etc. So some of those things. So I just want to say that again, to quote from the report, there were both, familial violence in that sense was not always singular or spectacular, the kind that Mihir was talking about. Those also stay with you, the stark forms of violence, but it was also insidious, and it was chronic, and it was everyday. which was come up in several forms, like one non-binary person told us about having to change the way they dress, the way they keep their hair every time they have to go home. Because that's the only way they can ensure that the parents will continue to pay for their education. So a range of microaggressions to the extreme forms of violence that we heard about. So this is sort of in short a large part of the report. The recommendations is something that I think Veena will talk about. I had, if we have time, do we have time? I had some just 2-3 comments that I wanted to make as I was reading the report. Like I said, I didn't write the report, so I had a chance now to read and step back and think about this. So one thing I was thinking about is, in 2016, Chair and I were involved in one study where we spoke to families who were supportive of their queer children. And I remember this mother who was, I think, in her early 70s telling us the story about her 2 sons who are both in their 40s. One of the sons is married with children and the other guy is a gay man. So she says that it's interesting that when there is any family function, particularly weddings, the married son gets a separate wedding invitation. The gay son, who's in his, who's an adult, he's not single, for the world he's single, his name is added to the invitation that comes to the mother and the father, right? So adult man, right? So I mean, just takes you back to the bit that Chanika started out with, which is a nice line in the report which says, this is a moment as much about family as it is about marriage. Yeah? And in some ways this respondent who told us about, it's that thing I said about adulting. I mean, in some ways in India, queer adulting is a failed project, right? Because you're not going to get married, you're not an adult, right? So in some ways this idea is so deeply rooted in society, and I think Veena says that in society and in law, the idea that you belong to your natal family, to your birth family, right? Irrespective of who they are to you and how they lead you. Yeah? So the only way to break from that is when you are allowed to make families of choice, right? And so therefore this moment is as much about families and our right to choose families, conjugal or not, as it is about being able to think about marriages. So that was just one thing that I wanted to talk about. The other, of course, is when you think of familial violence, actually as human rights defenders, all of us, it's not a new idea for us. But I think what the report does is it talks about familial violence in the specific context of queer and trans lives, and the specificities tend to be in some ways sort of different that we need to probably think about. And I remember reading way back when I was working on this book that I wrote, I remember reading this one line which has stayed with me forever, has changed a lot of work that I do, which says that for queer people, we are the only, we use the word sexual minority, right, gender minority. We are the only minority who's a minority in our own families. Yeah? So we don't hear of any other minority community that is a minority in their own family, and just think about the import of this idea. Because what it means in some ways is that for any other, and I'm not doing a comparison between the types of violence that people face, but I'm just saying that if I was someone who comes from a religious minority, today as a Muslim in India for example, if I were, and if I were to experience as a young person, as a child, someone refuses to eat from my tiffin in school, yeah? I feel broken-hearted, I feel rejected, right? But I don't have to wonder for too long whether it was because of me that this happened. There will be an adult around me, there will be probably a family member, someone, extended family, neighbor, who's going to tell me this is because you're Muslim. This is because there is some notion of food and who can eat what and all of those things, right? So, but if I am a queer person and I face rejection or I get questioned for my gender, my sexuality, I have to figure this out on my own. It's unlikely that most of us will grow up in queer and trans households. It's very unlikely that there is going to be an adult in my life who's going to tell me, nothing wrong with you. Yeah? It's very likely, therefore, as a minority in the context of my own family, where majority rules and norms around gender sexuality will prevail. So how do we start talking about this kind of a minority, people who are minority in their own family? And I think those are some of the Veena will also talk about this, but for me, when I said it really changed the way I thought about, and I do mental health work, and it really changed the way I thought about identity, selfhood, development of the self at all. Because I mean, I think one is of course that you have to find your own identity. Then Second is you have to find your identity while battling the whole question of is this abnormal, is this sinful, because there are going to be enough and more people. So again, that specificity that I'm talking about, if I transgress in many other ways, it's unlikely that my parents are going to say there is a doctor who will cure me. Yeah? It's unlikely that I'm going to be facing that kind of violence. There will be a whole bunch of other kinds of violence that will go on. And so the question is then that what does this minority status vis-a-vis majority values and norms of the family mean for the queer trans person, and how can their life be made livable? I mean, it's an interesting idea of livability of Butler that the report goes into as well, and not just tolerable or bearable. And here what we heard, testimonies after testimonies, were about somehow surviving, somehow becoming tolerable, becoming bearable, and thinking about whether my life is even plausible. So I mean, it's interesting that the Transgender Persons, what is called Protection of Rights Act, has a clause that talks about a trans person has a right to family home, but it doesn't talk about what is this family, and doesn't talk about what goes on in this family, right? And it's strange because again, in India, if we look at trans law 2019, but if we look at like 40 years ago, 50 years ago, how did trans lives become viable? Many people did choose to be part of Isla Garanas. So you have another kind of family that gets then criminalized because I have a right to my natal family. So I mean, even in the trans law, think about how we are, thinking about. I mean, it's so entrenched, the idea that family is where I belong. That's supposed to be the place of nurturing. Well, it's not. And then, what are some of the remedies we are thinking about? So with that, I'm just going to conclude by saying that the report goes into obviously a section on mental health, about suicide attempts, it goes into self-harm. There is one trans man who talks about having moved state, moved city, being hyper-vigilant, constantly thinking that somebody, his family would have sent people to get him, and having nightmares about it. And I just want to conclude with this, that how do we see mental health consequences of these kinds of violence that I was just describing? And it just reminds me of this report that some of us must have seen that came out in December by the Bebak Collective that talks about social suffering of Muslims in India. And I think it's truly, we have to think about some of these as social suffering. And we can't leave this, which is my favorite thing to say to any audience, we can't leave mental health and such like issues to doctors and experts. Because this is really about livability of lives. So with that,